I won't be telling this group anything new when I tell them that algorithms play a significant role in the infrastructure of our lives, a critical role in the infrastructure of our lives. And they do a lot of things for us. The most basic being they organize the information that we consume, from news to items from our friends, the way they're presented, the order they're presented into us, and the things that are presented are determined largely algorithmically. And in some ways, I think the job that's been most displaced by algorithms thus far would be the job of editor or information curator that used to exist in magazines. That job is largely handled algorithmically. But for some people, certainly other jobs have been done by algorithms. A lot of people, their work is assigned algorithmically. Uber, Deliveroo, the jobs that they do sequentially, sometimes on a minute-by-minute basis, are determined algorithmically. And of course, in Mechanical Turk, people are actually being assigned jobs algorithmically and acting as algorithms themselves in an odd sort of way. Certainly one of the things that people are most familiar with is who you might sleep with or marry is recommended algorithmically, and your friends as well. And certainly more profound roles are emerging, like the role that algorithms are playing in criminal justice, predictive policing, where algorithms determine for the consumption of police areas that may be likely for crime, and in justice, sentence recommendations and parole recommendations are often helped by algorithms that provide information to judges. So certainly they're having profound effects on our lives. Oh, I love this one in the middle down here. Is this, if you didn't see this in the news, some of you will know about the Chinese social scoring system, which is a big data analysis that basically in China is going to give you a score to say, effectively, are you a good citizen of China or not? And it's based on a variety of things, including basically your social media presence, but also things you do in life. Gives you access to things like travel and high quality goods that you can buy. You get social perks by having a high score. But one of the things they're experimenting with, these Chinese policemen are wearing augmented reality glasses that will help them identify potential offenders. So effectively, they'll do facial recognition and then label them with their social credit score. And if it's a low score, then they'll know there's somebody we might be concerned about. So a lot of people would find these things concerning, but certainly there are far more concerning things going on in our algorithmically mediated infrastructure in our lives. For instance, we've all seen the divisive ads that appear in social media that are fed to us, and that algorithms are manipulated to feed to us in a targeted fashion so that greater political polarization comes to exist. And I think we're all somewhat concerned about that. But there are things that jump up that some of you will know about that have made the news and been a bit disturbing. One of them being the unprofessional hair controversy, which I imagine people here at Google will be aware of, that a few years ago, if you Googled unprofessional hair, you got pictures of black women. And oddly, if any of you have not done this experiment, I do it every once in a while, you still get pictures of black women. You guys have fixed the problem, but the problem has not been fixed because now you get pictures of black women because this story existed. It's made a social feedback loop, and these social feedback loops are a big part of what I'm talking about today. And some of them you'll notice in this controversy is Microsoft's Tay Twitter bot that probably most of you know about, that they put up a Twitter bot that was supposed to learn to say things from other Twitter users, and very quickly it learned to say, amongst other things, we're going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it. So that tells you about the time that it came out. And it also learned to say, Hitler was right, I hate the Jews. And they had to take it down within 24 hours. Another controversy that you guys will be familiar with is the are women evil, are Jews evil controversy. Carol Cadwalder in the Observer discovered that if you typed in those, the Google suggest came up with are Jews evil and are women evil. This has been corrected for, obviously. However, you still get some pretty funny things. I've given this talk in a lot of places. I gave it up near Liverpool at the Blue Dot Festival, and I used the "Our Scousers," and it immediately told me "Our Scousers thieves" came up, and that really works for the audience. And then the other one was the Welsh. You have to look down quite a ways there, but if you put "Are the Welsh," this is at the number 6 festival, inbred is one of the suggestions. Now, as you guys know, these are all things that people actually searched for, but again, I'm talking about feedback loops. Things that are a bit more disturbing, obviously the labeling of a black couple as gorillas that occurred a number of years ago that's been worked with is a disturbing phenomena. Apparent algorithmic racism that we need to be concerned about. And this woman down at the bottom is Joy Bualawini. I always mispronounce her name, but she's a researcher who discovered that many of the facial recognition algorithms that exist don't see her face, unless she puts on a white mask, and then it does. And she also discovered the rather disturbing fact that a while ago, if you typed in black girls, you got pictures of porn. That was the number one, black girls generated pictures of porn as search results. So we have to think about, why is this happening? Why are these things that are apparent racism happening in our algorithmically mediated infrastructure of our entire world? And there are several theories. One theory is that big data is a scary mirror. Effectively, we've held the mirror up to ourselves and we found out we're kind of racist. And I'm not saying that's not true. There's some truth to that, for sure. Another thing that's popular in the media is that it's the alt-right programmer ecosystem, that there are people out there manipulating the algorithms in order to make certain kinds of political things happen. That's certainly not untrue as well. There's some truth to that. And certainly lack of diversity in computing is an issue as well. But that's not the thing I'm here to talk about. Theory 3 is the thing I'm here to talk about, and that's that there's something about algorithms. There's something about algorithms that leads them to propagate a certain kind of way of looking at people. And I know something about certain ways of looking at people because this is where I'm from, all right? I'm from America, obviously. I've been British for quite some time, but this is my country of birth. And this map is colored based on the results of the 2016 presidential election by county across the United States. Blue being Democratic, red being Republican. This makes it look like America's majority Republican, but that's only by land mass, it's not by population. If you resize this map, and you can find maps online that will do this, resize this map based on population, you'll see that it's about half and half. That's because America's population are concentrated on the West Coast and the East Coast. So the center shrinks and you get about half and half of blue and red. But the place I'm from particularly is here, is Alabama. I'm from Alabama. I came here 22 years ago from Alabama. And you guys, some of you would have come to the talk last month by an author, the author Louis Dartnell of Origins, How the Earth Made Us. Interesting talk. And he showed you this diagram. And what he was talking about is this Democratic voting band here is what we in America call the black belt. And the reason it exists is because geophysically, that area, Dartnell told you this, geophysically, that area is where certain soil conditions exist that grow certain crops very well, in particular cotton. And therefore, this was the concentration of slavery in the South, a high concentration. And these counties are still majority black counties. But there's one outlier, and it's that blue one up here, right? The high blue dot in Alabama. That's Jefferson County, and that's where I'm from. I'm from Jefferson County, Alabama. I'm from Birmingham, which is the biggest city in Alabama now. And it's not a part of the slavery narrative. It is, but it was a city that existed before slavery. It's a post-slavery city. And the reason it came into existence is because it was discovered that in Birmingham, Alabama, it's the only place on earth where you can get all the ingredients to make high-quality steel in a single place. And the reason it's called Birmingham is obvious then, right? It's from your Birmingham. It's a steel town. It's a new Birmingham in America. And it was founded in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it drew in people from all over the world. Eastern European Jews came to Birmingham to run retail businesses. Italians came to Birmingham to run the grocery business. Scottish people who had lost their jobs in the coal gas industry outside Glasgow because coal gas became a redundant technology because of electrification. And so they all lost their jobs and they all came across and went to places like Birmingham. There's a big Scottish settlement. And those are my ancestors. My ancestors are people who lived outside Glasgow and mined coal there and then lost their jobs and came to Birmingham, Alabama. So And also, of course, there was a black community there at post-slavery, and I say post-slavery in quotes because of laws in Alabama, they were worked like slaves in the mines in many ways as well. But the thing I want to point out is that there was a great deal of ethnic diversity in Jefferson County. It's one of the most ethnically diverse counties in the South. However, diversity and mixing are not the same thing. Now, while Jefferson County, Alabama had a great deal of diversity, it had very little in the way of mixing. And that's because of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws that restricted things like people using the same water fountains, people sitting in the same area on buses, people using the same dressing rooms to try on clothes, and even in Birmingham, the most segregated city on the earth in the time of the Civil Rights Movement, you were not allowed to play any board games or card games with a person of a different color by law. You couldn't play checkers with a black guy if you're a white guy. So Jim Crow laws were a huge part of the history of the South, and they're what prevented whites and blacks in particular from mixing. But it's also a part of my history in some ways. When I was born, my parents had to cross barricades to get to the hospital because a protest had broken out, organized here at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, a real stalwart of the civil rights movement that organized one of the most successful civil rights protests of the civil rights era, the Children's Crusade, where children left their schools and marched in the streets to end the Jim Crow laws of Birmingham, Alabama, of a particular city. And they were, of course, subjected to Bull Connor's water cannons. Protesters were subjected to outright violence in the streets, and kids even had attack dogs sicked on them. And this was going on while I was being born. I was actually being born while these protests were going on. Now, 14 days after my birth, this led to the end of the Jim Crow laws in Birmingham. There was so much public embarrassment from this terrible event that the merchants and leaders of Birmingham settled, and basically on a legal basis you could try on clothes in the same place, black and white people could try on clothes in the same place, black and white people could drink from the same water fountains, black and white people could sit in the same areas of a bus, and that's because of these children. Now, then I started growing up. So I grew up in a world post-Jim Crow laws. That's not to say I grew up in a world where there was mixing between the races in Birmingham, Alabama, believe me. This is me as a little boy with my sister and her doggie. And this is me when my grandfather took me to see The Bootlegger. Bootleggers for British people, people who make illegal moonshine. And those two fellas are guys who ran a still that my grandfather used to get his liquor from. And so, as you can see, I was a bit of a weedy kid, and I was very bookish, and that didn't do me any well at my first school. My first school was this place. I always like to show that picture to British audiences because the fact that there's a giant emblazoned American flag and eagle on the front of an elementary school is strange to the British consciousness. This was my school, E.B. Irwin High School, and when I was there, I was a horribly bullied kid. I had a really hard time as a kid. Just didn't fit in very well. But there were people who were coming into my school who fitted in even more poorly because the government had ruled that it wasn't enough to get rid of the Jim Crow laws. You had to bring people together. You had to make people mix because they were not mixing. Schools were still segregated by the way people lived. Effectively, there were white suburbs and black suburbs. So kids from an area called Airport Heights, effectively a ghetto outside Birmingham's airport, were put on buses and brought to my school, and that had a profound effect on my life. I remember one day when I was pushed down in the lunch line, and I got pushed down and had to go to the back of the line. In the back of the line were all the black kids. We're always in the back of the line to get lunch. And a little girl named Laretha Jackson said to me, she said, "You always go around looking at your feet. If you don't hold your head up, people are going to beat you down your whole life." And that changed me. That changed my life. It made me a stronger person. It's the most important piece of advice I've ever gotten. It made me a stronger person. It made sure I'd never be a racist. because this fear I had of black people. As a bullied kid, when black kids came in, I thought those kids were going to beat me up, right? Because they were scary black kids. They didn't care about beating me up. They had more important things to do. In fact, the bullies concentrated on them and stopped concentrating on me. So in many ways, that really made my life. That little girl, those buses, those laws that changed Birmingham from a city that was unmixed to a city that mixed changed my life. So I owe a lot to the Bluebird Jefferson County school bus that basically brought a lot to me. And it's more than that, because I ended up being on these buses myself soon after that. Soon after that, I was bused away to this school, my second school, which is an old 1930s building in Birmingham. Happens to sit in the middle of a black ghetto itself, but it was a ghetto on the other side of the mountain where rich kids lived. And this school was primarily occupied by kids from a different social class than me. I was a lower middle class kid. Most of the kids who went there were the sons of lawyers and doctors and university researchers. And so I was bused to this school, which ironically, though it was in the middle of a black neighborhood, had one black student out of 250 kids. Now this is in a county that has 40% black people. Now why did this have so few black people in it? Because this is the Jefferson County School for the Gifted and Talented. And the reason that I was brought to that school is I scored rather high on an IQ test. So ironically, this took me from the first change in my life where I realized that mixing between racial groups taught me something in my life, to where I mixed with class groups that also taught me other things in my life, but it all came through the IQ test. Now, it's ironic that the IQ test has played such an important role in my life, because now I'm a faculty member at University College London, and in many ways the reason that the IQ test is such an important algorithmic part of our society, and has been for a century more or less, is because of things that happened at UCL. And I'll get to that by telling you a little history story. So there's a lot of history stories in the book. This is one of the primary ones. Anybody know who this guy is? Probably not. This is Darwin, but not Charles Darwin. This is Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather. And he is the guy who wrote about evolution, social evolution, the belief that society evolved through the action of selection, in effect. Erasmus Darwin believed in that. He also believed biology worked that way. So he had the evolution idea before Charles Darwin, in fact 100 years before Charles Darwin. But there were some steps that had to take place to get from there to science. And the steps were this. First, Alphonse Quetelet was a guy who basically had looked at the bell curve that came out of Carl Gauss's work in astronomy as a way of dealing with errors in scientific measurement. And what he had looked at is he had thought about this and said, okay, people should vary. There should be errors around an ideal for people. And that ideal he thought of was kind of the gladiator, the ideal soldier. And he took measurements of chest girth of Scottish soldiers and basically showed that they were distributed on a bell curve. And he thought of the middle as being this ideal, and anything higher or lower was a deviant, right? And he used the term deviant, and deviation is a term we use scientifically quite a lot around things like bell curves now, but deviant is what he basically used the term for. So that was the first idea. Variation of humanity around an ideal was the first idea. Second idea that came in is this is Thomas Malthus, who was here in London, was a cleric who basically believed that evolutionary utopianism was a non-Christian bad idea, the idea that we'd evolve to a better state. He basically believed that resource limitations would ultimately lead to people basically overproducing, and then there being a steady state misery that kept us from going any further. So effectively there was a cap on how much society can evolve. Now, ironically, Charles Darwin took these two ideas, the idea of variation around an ideal and the idea of resource limitations limiting the advance of humanity, and turned them on their heads. He took variation from Quetelet and said there's always variation biologically. Mutations cause variation. He took resource limitations from Malthus and said resource limitations mean that not everybody gets to reproduce. You put those two things together and what you get is advancement. He didn't look at the mean as being the ideal. The mean was the current state. you could advance forward through the resource limitations. And that invented the theory of biological evolution. Now, that was biological evolution, not his grandfather's idea of social evolution. However, and I do want to point out this is the idea of natural selection that Darwin came up with now, which is the foundation of evolution. Now, this is Herb Spencer, who was a great thinker of his time, largely forgotten now, but a very important intellectual of his time. And he took this idea back to Erasmus Darwin and said, society evolves too. There's this arrow of perfectibility that we're moving up as we evolve human beings, as we evolve society. So the idea of social Darwinism comes from Herb Spencer. And he also changed the word that from natural selection. He changed over this idea of survival of the fittest, and the idea that there's a fittest and we're optimizing towards it comes from Spencer. Darwin really liked this idea. Darwin put it in the 5th version of Origin of the Species, and it became dogma, effectively, that there's survival of the fittest. Now, the fittest is a bit of a tautological argument, but it does bring in this idea that we're evolving towards better human beings. We're on this unipolar optimizing track, right? So that was then taken up by Darwin's first cousin, Francis Galton, who was one of the people who was behind the founding of UCL. And Francis Galton invented a new idea, a distinctly British idea called eugenics. This is the Office of the Eugenics Society here in the UK. The eugenics department, the first eugenics department of the university was at UCL, the UCL Eugenics Department. And UCL has a great history in eugenics. Wonderful liberal institution, UCL. First place you get a college degree in England and not be in the Church of England. Most people don't know that. It was up until UCL's foundation, you could not get a college degree in England and Scotland, I believe. Ireland ran ahead of us slightly on this. But basically, a great, tolerant, progressive institution that very much believed that eugenics was the future of a progressive society. And the Eugenics Society was a very progressive idea, a very liberal idea. Members included Carl Pearson, of course, Neville Chamberlain, John Maynard Keynes, Margaret Sanger. Many people believed that eugenics was a way to improve the lot of humanity. And that went along just fine for a while. And I love this diagram that I found. This is from a eugenics text. And you note, I've talked about this optimizing line. We have here the progression of humanity forward, right, along the skulls of people and measuring how their cranial capacity contained bigger and bigger brains as you moved up this scale. And even though some of the larger skulls might be down here in the scale, the cranial capacity was smaller. So effectively, those were people who were more inferior intellectually. You note that down here at the end, we have the kind of European Caucasoid man. And then you have the Greek statue, just like Quetelet, the Greek statue of the ideal that we're trying to evolve towards. All of that craniology stuff was brought down by this woman. And let me tell you, it's hard to find a picture of a woman scientist from the turn of the century. This is a picture from a tea party. She is listed as third from the left. It's a tea party with Carl Pearson, the famous scientist. And there are a few women there from science. And this is Alice Lee, who did a very important piece of work. You've heard of Carl Pearson, I'm sure, Pearson correlation coefficient, but you haven't heard of Alice Lee, have you? And some of you may have, but I really doubt it. But Alice Lee, what she did was so incredibly clever. UCL had the largest collection of human skulls in the world. They had collected human skulls for eugenics research to basically say, look, here are African skulls, here are European skulls. Look, one has a bigger cranial capacity than the other. And what she did is she basically, by measuring the cranial capacity, filling skulls up with sand and emptying them out and weighing the sand and using statistical calculations to take external measures of the skulls to basically infer a formula, two formulae, that said how much cranial capacity there was based on these external things. She verified it very thoroughly, and then what she did is she took all the anatomists who believed in the craniology theory and listed off how big their brains were. And at a conference in Glasgow, she brought down craniology, and craniology ended then. But that was the end of scientific eugenics research by a long shot. I'm going to digress from eugenics for a minute and leave England and go to France. This is Alfred Binet, the founder of the IQ test, who the reason he brought in the IQ test is very interesting. The French and the English both delayed educating their children to an advanced age long after most of Europe and America had started educating their children into their teens. Effectively, for some reason France was delayed, for some reason England was delayed. France was delayed because of the controversy between the Catholic Church and the government. England was delayed because of class issues around education. But nonetheless, when Binet came along and studied intelligence, he basically found that he thought intelligence was very complex. He studied chess players that had feelings, images, emotions. All of these things are involved in intelligence. And he thought intelligence was very complex. Yet, he came up with a test that generated a bell curve to classify these children. But he was very careful in his lifetime to say, all he was trying to do really was say, kids who do poorly on this test are probably kids who need some more help in school. And he spent his entire life, and his partner, Simon, spent his entire life saying the IQ test shouldn't be used to categorize people. It should be something that's used to help people who are on the low end, otherwise we should ignore its results. However, that's not how things turned out. These two gentlemen, back to England again, this is Carl Pearson and Charles Spearman, and some of you will know them from, if you're algorithmists, you'll kind of know that they're the guys who developed factor analysis and principal component analysis and a number of other statistical techniques that are commonplace in the algorithms that we use today. And the reason those algorithms are used, you'll know, is to reduce complicated data sets down to simpler features. And what they did, just like in France, children had started being educated to a high age. They had a lot of exam scores that they could look at. And what they were trying to do is use PCA, really, to identify a principal axis in these exam scores that indicated that there was a G factor, a general intelligence factor, that underlied all academic success. And that effectively intelligence could be brought down to a single number that they implied was genetic. And that was the goal of this research. In many ways, most of the statistical techniques we use in algorithms today for the reduction of data have origins that go back to the beginning of the eugenics movement. So that worked out fine in Britain. Britain, the eugenics movement was largely a progressive idea, not so much in America. This is Henry Goddard, who took the idea of the G factor, right? He took the idea of the G factor and said, well, I'll take that and I'll combine it with this French test, the IQ test, which had been brought over to America. And then I'll use it to categorize people for purposes of limiting immigration into the United States. Because after the potato famine, there had been a great influx of Irish people who were basically thought of by both the English and the Americans as inferior, genetically inferior. This is something we've all forgotten, but it was very commonplace to believe that the Irish were genetically inferior in England and in America. And Italians were coming over too, and they thought those were kind of a bit dark people and they were a little inferior too. So they had this idea that they had to weed these inferior people out. And what they did it with was the IQ test. And in fact, Goddard used this to categorize people, and he came up with some very interesting categories. Goddard invented the word moron. The word moron did not exist before Henry Goddard in English. So he basically took the IQ test and he came up with definite areas of the IQ test range that were idiot, imbecile, moron, normal, gifted. And that was used not only to exclude people for purposes of immigration, it was used to sterilize people well into the 60s and 70s. Okay? People were sterilized based on their inferior results in this digestion of things well into that. So I want to point out that this is all about simplifying and generalizing around quantitative values. What we've done is taken human beings and simplifies them and generalize them using numbers. And that's something that has a rather unsavory history. In America, this is a eugenics kind of bulletin board. It says some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And the Americans really made negative eugenics into a real thing. I mean, it was they were the kings of negative eugenics up until the time that it was taken up by the Nazis. And the Nazis, here's the burden of the racial groups on the Aryan man. Same sort of idea taken up by the Nazis. And of course, the Nazis continued this in a brutal and horrible way. They were still using the skull measurement technique, even though Alice Lee had largely disproved it. And they also enacted laws that basically were based on the idea that some people are down on the inferior end of the scale and some people on the superior end of the scale. The Nuremberg laws, which most Americans won't realize, were advised by this man, Laughlin, who was one of the guys who came up with racial anti-mixing laws in the United States. The United States had the longest laws against miscegenation, marriage between the races, of any country that's ever been on Earth. The longest time. So, and it was into the 60s. You couldn't marry a black woman in America into the 60s. In certain states, but you know, it's still a shocking thing. But yet, this is how we think of America with the Nazis, right? America knocking out the horrible Nazi menace. And we think of that about Britain as well, as you know, we brought down the Nazi menace. We banned eugenics from consciousness. Eugenics disappeared as a word that people in polite society would use and think about as this way of social engineering, because the Nazis had made it so bad that it became unpalatable. The one thing that survived was the IQ test. The idea of data analysis to categorize people persisted well into the modern era and persists to this day. As some of you know, these topics are not gone away by the slightest. So the idea of data analysis to categorize people is a live idea, an idea with a history that cannot be disconnected from racism. So the question is that the indicator that there's something about algorithms? Well, I believe it is, and I'm going to say this. Algorithms are prejudiced. Algorithms are prejudiced, and this is a bold statement that I make because I believe it's true, and it's true for the following reason. Let's think about what prejudice means. Prejudice means to prejudge, and how does one prejudge? One prejudges by simplification and generalization. Now, those of you who work in AI will know that AI algorithms are designed to simplify and generalize. That's their job, and that's a good thing. You know, simplifying and generalizing about complex things can be very, very valuable, but it has to be mediated, particularly when it's about people. Now, the way that we do, most of you will know that algorithms that are doing various things out there are largely based on the idea of optimizing some value. There's always something you're trying to maximize. And these things, simplifying, generalizing, and optimizing value, are core principles for a scientific approach to basically trying to manage data and understand data. There's nothing wrong with that, but its history has had a dramatic impact on society when it's applied to human beings. And it is being applied to human beings, and I want to think about, for just a minute, digress and think about what it's doing on social networks. Now, this is based on some work I did with some students at UCL that basically is about, we did some analytic work about the dynamics of social network opinions that are being influenced by simplifying, generalizing value-driven algorithms. So there's a little social network for you. Now, the results I'm going to talk about are all analytical results. So they're for arbitrarily large networks. These things are true, but I'm showing you a little illustrative picture. So here's their network, and you've got the greenish blobs are rational people in this social network who are connected to some other entities in the network. The colored balls are the balls that have one opinion in a binary social controversy, say election of a single candidate, or opinion on a particular political movement, or opinion on a particular scientific issue. The opposite opinion in that binary issue are these largely white marbles. And so what happens in the social network is everybody broadcasts their opinion. Right? Everybody broadcasts their opinion, but who you hear from depends on who you're connected to. And if you're a rational actor, you make decisions based on what you hear, which is what a rational person should do. What happens in the dynamics of this, oh, by the way, I have to say, these colored and white balls, they're not rational. They're motivated reasoners. They always emphasize the same opinion. They've decided, and that's it. So what they do is they influence and they recruit, because if you look at the way I've progressed this graph, is if you're surrounded by a majority from one point of view, you're getting recruited in to be a sort of a quasi-motivated reasoner, right? You come to act as if you're one of the brightly colored balls, one of the white colored balls. And eventually what that means is everyone is recruited in one way or another. Now, we've shown analytically that this leads to a polarization, where effectively in a binary issue, you're always going to have one side of the network go in one direction, one side go in the other direction, and it's a steady state. You know, you'll converge to a steady state, and it's very difficult to get opinions to move once you've converged in this steady state. Now, so in some extent, in this little example that I've given you, this has divided the coloreds and the whites. Now, that's a bit acute of me to refer back to the water fountains in Birmingham, but I want to say this isn't cute. It's been shown by the Pew Research Center that the likelihood of seeing news that's relevant to issues of race is much higher for people of color in America than it is for people who consider themselves white. So effectively, the information polarization that goes on is a kind of digital segregation that is actively going on. So the question is, what can we do about this? If I'm right, and this simplifying, generalizing, algorithmic way of looking at the world is causing some of the problems we're seeing online, then what can we do about it? And what I'd say we can do about it is we can look at the facts and design our algorithms to overcome some particular historical biases and assumptions. I want to talk a little bit about how I think about that. One is we have this assumption from Darwin, really, and from Erasmus Darwin, really, that there's this unipolar optimization going on in the world of some measure of value. Economics brings this idea in as well. And that somewhere down here, humans are making decisions up to this quality. And algorithmically, we should be able to get AIs to make a higher quality decision. And this unipolar view is built into a lot of the zeitgeist of people's thinking. That view was broken up for me when I did some work back in the 1990s with this woman, Stephanie Forrest, who's a woman who did a lot of the work in what was called at that time computer immunology. And she was looking at the real live immune system and simulating it with evolutionary algorithms. And I, being an arrogant young man with a PhD, looked at her experiments and said, that can't work. Evolutionary algorithms are optimizing algorithms. They're going to drive you to a single antigen. The idea of a diverse set of antigens coming out of the kind of simulation she was using had to be wrong. She had to have stopped the algorithm too early. It has to converge. That was because of my optimizing look, my unipolar value optimizing look at the way I thought evolution worked. Turns out, we did some studies, and in the real immune system, effectively it's more like this, is that you've got this unimodal, not bell curve looking kind of distribution of the effectiveness of antibodies. And effectively, because of various effects that happen in real world immune system evolution, it will diversify. And that's when I made a realization that survival of the fittest isn't what evolution does. Survival of the fittest is an idea that embeds the idea that we're maximizing value through evolution. And in fact, even in genetic algorithms, you can show that what's really going on is an effective balancing of diversity with advancement. And I took that work, I took those ideas, and I did some of the earliest computational creativity work for the Air Force and NASA to basically figure out how to learn fighter combat maneuvers from simulation. And it was a very effective thing to do, and worked really well. I kind of built a career on this idea. But this is an idea based on the idea that evolution should have more than one thing in it. And this is a diagram from some evolutionary algorithms that were worked on a long time ago by my PhD supervisor, Dave Goldberg. And what he basically showed, both analytically and in this graph empirically, if you look at evolution, algorithms that do evolution, what you find out is that there's an area, this middle area is where they work. Outside this area, they fail. They fail. And in particular, this axis is really the axis of survival of the fittest. This is the axis of driving towards the observed best. If you do only that drive, you end up out here in a failure region. And I've kind of made a simpler diagram of this. out here in this failure region, evolution does not take place. Survival of the fittest, not enough. The other thing you need is mixing. And this is the re-simplified, simplified diagram. One of the most gratifying things about the book thus far has been somebody took this diagram and made it better. A guy sent this out on a blog piece that I really appreciated. And what he really saw was this, is out here in this region, we end up with fragile systems. If you drive out towards the observed best, you end up with brittle, fragile systems. In order for interesting evolution to occur, you need to be in that band that balances mixing and survival of the fittest. Now, what I'm trying to say is this. This is a technical effect. This is an effect we can explore as scientists. This is an effect we can build into our algorithms. The balancing of mixing and survival of the fittest. The balancing of driving towards what we think what's the observed best is and some metric we're using to optimize an algorithm we've built. And a metric that basically says how diverse are the outputs we're giving to human beings. By concentrating on the idea that there's this edge of chaos phenomena, we can actually come up with algorithms that do something that is productive evolution, and algorithms are showing us that's what we should do. That's the right look at evolution, right? And what we're designing online in the massive networks that we're building is an evolutionary system. And we need to emphasize that idea that diversity preservation is an important part of what we need to build. So what I'm talking about is a science-led shift in perspective away from simplifying, generalizing, value-driven, survival of the fittest ideas that descend from this past that we have that's taken social science and turned it into an optimization problem, towards the idea of diversity preservation with mixing. And I want everyone here to think about, in all the different algorithms they implement that do different things, what that means. What does it mean to not have an answer come out of an algorithm that is the pat answer that says, here's the maximum value as far as I can aware. Instead, giving diverse alternatives as answers and trying to promote diversity actively in order to have more functional algorithmic infrastructure for the future that may end some of these problems of apparent intolerance that seem to pop out of the feedback loops between people and algorithms. And I think if we do this, you know, we can be the agent. We can be the agent of change the way this school bus was the agent of change in my past and the agent of change for a whole generation. So that's my talk. I'd be glad to answer some questions. Yeah, have we got one back there?
To phrase this in a way that's perhaps close to the meat of the matter for a company like Google.
Yes.
Which fundamentally, to steal a phrase from Mark Zuckerberg, we sell ads. That suggests that things that optimize, for example, saying, oh, this is the perfect ad that will get the maximum response, is actually the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
And in fact, you want to say, this may not be the perfect ad, but it's an ad in the general area of what we're interested in.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, you know, I know that companies like Google and all the big tech companies are concerned about their social responsibility. They've become so important that they should be concerned about it, and I'm glad that they are, and I believe that they are. I think that these principles, the idea of offering diversity instead of just a value maximizing outcome, are principles they can adopt before the government comes in and starts trying to regulate these industries the way that they regulated the broadcasters in the broadcast era. So I think that, yeah, I think that those kind of principles need to be brought into every aspect of the big tech movement, really. And I think responsibly it can be done by the corporations themselves before the government starts in a ill-informed way imposing regulation. And I'm also talking to people in government about this as well, because I want, when regulation does come in, and it will, that it comes in some way that isn't draconian and doesn't strangle innovation.
Well, first, thank you. That was amazing. Kind of playing devil's advocate, thinking really far ahead, like, how do we do this in a way that, like, doesn't end up looking like the affirmative action thing where you say, like, you need X number of this kind of people and X number of that kind of people, and how do you define, like, how would this look like in a best case where it is somehow natural and organic and representative of us in a good way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this idea of diversity is not, the problem with the kind of eugenics view of the world is a simple-minded view of what's best. A simple-minded view of what diverse is just as bad, right? In your particular algorithm where you're serving ads, for instance, what does it mean to be a diverse ad? It's not, I need more people of certain orientations or certain colors in it. It's something about that's more complex than that we as scientists can study, all right? I don't think it's, I think our simple-minded notions of diversity now are artifacts, ironically, of the simple-minded ideas we have of superiority and inferiority. So studying what diversity means in a particular algorithmic context is a careful design job for algorithmists. So I'm not, when I use the phrase diversity and mixing, mixing is pretty clear. I think mixing, getting people to mix, that's pretty clear. Diversity can have these sort of pablum meanings, which I think are not really what I'm on about. Nonetheless, hey, look, the reality is when in 1987, when I started in computer science, what was the fastest growing field for women in education? Anybody want to guess? Computer science was the fastest growing, and it was at 40%, which was reflective of about 60% of men, 60% of university students were men, and about 40% were women. So it was at effective parity, right? It's 18% now. It's 18%. That's got to change. Something has gone horribly wrong. And I think some of this stuff has to do with that. There's a whole chapter in the book about the role of women in computing and how important women have been to computing and how little it's recognized. So I hope you read that chapter.
My question is probably a simplification / follow-up to the previous two questions. Is the graph that you had with the ideal band for general improvement, is that something that you think can be quantifiably measured?
Yes.
Because the appeal of the previous sort of single axis value optimizing function was that it can be very easily measured and you can measure your improvements on that axis.
Yeah, I do think that the edge of chaos effect can be quantitatively measured. I do think it has to be adaptively measured because I think any quantification we come up with is probably going to dissolve the way that market information effectively dissolves into a market. So I think that we're looking at a problem of continuous adaptation. Nonetheless, I think there are technical metrics for, am I at a productive level in that 2 graph? Am I able to be in that band? I do think this is a research question that can be explored. And people who have been doing edge of chaos type work in complex systems have already been doing that, not in the context I'm talking about. So I do think there is a technical angle of research for this work.
I had a quick question about your statement that algorithms are prejudiced.
Yes.
I guess I was wondering, it seems like a lot of the way we use the word prejudice, at least in modern society, seems to indicate that there's like an assumption that's powering the simplification and generalization. And I was wondering, how do we remove those kinds of same assumptions from bleeding into the algorithms that we produce?
That's a fascinating question. Thank you. Here's the thing, is I'm a believer that all representations are biased. It's impossible to have and I mean that in the technical sense of bias, not in the kind of social sense of bias. Representations induce bias. My favorite quote, which is a mantra in the book, is George Box's quote where he said, all models are wrong, some models are useful. So in that sense, when you simplify or generalize, when you come up with a representation for a complex problem, you are inducing biases. And that can't be avoided. The only thing you can do is, like Box said, some models are useful. So you have to kind of be aware of those biases and then adapt around them and be able to basically say, okay, this is a representation. I got this result. It's a representational artifact. Now I need to change things. So effectively, I'm a great believer that you can't take the human out of the loop, because the great things human beings do is they deal with the deep uncertainties of the world adaptively and in an ongoing fashion that becomes an evolving system. So I guess, can you remove, the question was, can you remove the biases that sit behind the prejudging? I guess my answer is no, you can't. They will change continuously. and we have to be involved in that process continuously. Hope that answers your question.
A few of us here actually work using deep learning to build some predictive models in essentially to predict and prevent deterioration of patients in hospitals. So we work directly on healthcare. And one of our main drivers is obviously patient outcomes and how can we save lives at the end of the day, right? To put in simplistic terms. How should we take your takeaway of the do not maximize the sort of maximum utility and survival of the fittest in that kind of environment? That's
a good question and a deeply technical question that we probably have to consult on to really understand. However, I'll say this is a long time ago I did some routing, some work where I was doing genetic algorithms-based routing for military vehicles. And one of the things I found out is the commanders didn't like a black box outcome. And the reason they didn't like that is because they'd say, I'm going to be flying this missile through this territory, and I've had a model now of what I think the threat environment is. And the commanders at that time were very aware of the fact that models are just models. And what they wanted was diverse solutions. So they wanted the algorithm to tell them not a probability distribution around a single route. They wanted it to give me, this route looks good and this route looks good. They wanted different routes. So they wanted a diversity presented to the human being for the final decision, because then they used their gut, right? They used their gut and said, okay, the algorithm says that's the best route, but we're going to fly this one because I don't believe it. I think in general, when making recommendations to human beings, this idea of providing a diverse set of outcomes from the algorithm, because as you know, algorithms with a tweak here or there will go somewhere different, right? So those false minima in optimizing a deep learning neural network, those minima that under your criteria for optimizing the algorithm come out to be false minima may be valuable. So I think ultimately out of algorithms you should come out with a diversity of solutions that's manageable to the human mind and explicable. And I think that's the way I would try to do it, is never give a human a black box decision from an algorithm, because they're going to believe it and they're not going to understand the underlying assumptions you made along the way, which could be fatal in some instance. I mean, you know, none of us can foresee the unforeseen future, and no algorithm can either. So you need to give people the ability to have, you know, adaptive solutions, and I think some of that is giving them a diversity of solutions.
So I want to know how practical actually to make our algorithms diverse and not prejudiced, because based on just my experience, for example, if you're working on a feature, making it do 1, 2, 3, it's okay. Then making it 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's really hard.
Yeah. Well, what in the evolutionary computation community, the kind of technical way that you do it is, I mean, there's something called niching that's done in GAs, and the way you really do it is you come up with a way of saying, if my population is all looking too similar, in a Malthusian sort of way, in a Thomas Malthus sort of way, you lower their productivity by basically saying everything's too similar. And when you do that, you get the pushback effect that leads to balance. And these immune system simulations I talked about, the interesting thing that came out of them was the reason you get a diverse set of antigens, of antibodies, is because when the antibodies cling to the antigen, they block other antibodies from clinging to the antigen. So they've absorbed the resource. That causes the fitness of that kind of antigen to drop. So, but if it dropped so much that you wouldn't get the sticking in the first place. So the idea, you get this, and this was what happens in real evolution. You get resource consumption pressuring away from uniformity of solution. So in general, my advice, and we'd have to look at it technically for any particular application, but in general, the kind of advice is this, is put in evolutionary pressures that drive away from homogeneity and then let the emergent effect come out, right? And the emergent effect generally is a balancing effect. But that, I think for a particular application, we have to look at it in deep technical detail, but I think that's the general advice.
I think you made a great point about how reason maybe why algorithms are inherently biased is because of the simplification. But I guess my question is, what is your opinion in that, like humans, like I guess you mentioned how humans are different, but one could argue that humans also, when making decisions, often try to like make a rational decision by formulaically making the pros and cons and simplifying things. So do you think it's actually different?
Humans absolutely simplify and generalize in order to make every decision they make. what has to come into that is think of it this way. You probably know people, I know people who treat people in horribly simplifying, generalizing ways, and they're not people who are my friends, but who make judgments about people based on really, I'd say gender is the number one. I mean, I know, I've met lots of men in my life who basically treat women and men profoundly differently because they're making that simplifying judgment. We have a tendency to simplify and generalize. We have morals and ethics that come in to cancel out our ability to do that, to basically go in and say, look, I'm not going to judge this person based on the color of their skin or based on their gender, even though I might, look, I grew up in a horribly racist, horribly sexist place. Those things are in me, right? I can't get away from it. Constant vigilance is the only thing I can have, is I have to remind myself, don't judge people based on the way you were brought up as a kid. And I hope that that's become so ingrained now that I don't have to think about it. I would say it's more difficult for a man growing up in our world to not view people on the basis of gender than it is to overcome racism. And I think it's a constant vigilant struggle. You have to constantly tell yourself. So yeah, people are simplifying. That's why we have moral codes. That's why we teach children to, don't simplify people. Don't judge people just because they look different from you. You have to teach children that. Yeah.
We are unfortunately running out of time. So once again, thank you, Robert Elliott Smith.